Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1. The Neighbor Who Watched Through the Fence. The first time I saw him standing there, I thought he was just checking on his tomato plants, but when I looked closer, I realized he wasn't looking at his garden at all. He was staring directly at my back door, completely motionless, and I swear to God he didn't blink once. That's when I knew something was wrong with Gerald. I moved into the house on Maple Street in early March, right after my divorce was finalized. It was a small 2-bedroom ranch with a fenced backyard. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet, tree-lined streets, families with kids, the kind of place where people still waved at each other. Gerald lived in the house directly behind mine, and our backyards shared a wooden privacy fence that had seen better days. When I first met him, he seemed like exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want. He was in his late 60s, retired from some government job he never quite specified, and he made a point of introducing himself the day I moved in. He brought over a plate of store-bought cookies and told me if I ever needed anything, just holler over the fence. He mentioned that he was home most of the time so he could keep an eye on my place when I was at work. At the time, I thought that was thoughtful. I worked long hours as a nurse at County General, often pulling 12-hour shifts, so having someone watching out for the house seemed like a blessing. The first few weeks were fine. I'd see Gerald in his yard occasionally, puttering around with his plants or sitting on his back porch with a beer. He'd wave, I'd wave back, and that was the extent of our interaction. Normal neighbor stuff. I felt safe knowing someone was around, especially since the neighborhood had apparently had a string of break-ins the previous summer. But then I started noticing the pattern. It was subtle at first. I'd be in my kitchen making coffee before work, and I'd glance out the window and see him standing at the fence line. He'd be facing my house, not moving, just standing there with his hands at his sides. The fence was about 5.5 feet tall, so I could see from his shoulders up. At first, I figured he was just spacing out the way people do sometimes when they're lost in thought. I didn't think much of it. But then it happened again, and again. Always at the same time, around 6:45 in the morning, right when I was getting ready for work. I'd look out, and there he'd be, in the exact same spot, staring at my back door. He never waved anymore, never acknowledged me if I happened to catch his eye. He just stood there, perfectly still like a statue. I told myself I was being paranoid. He was an old man, probably bored, probably just watching the birds or something. But the thing that bothered me was his expression. It wasn't blank or neutral, it was focused, intent. Like he was studying something, waiting for something to happen. After about 2 weeks of this, I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. I'd find myself rushing through my morning routine, avoiding the kitchen window, feeling this creeping sense of being observed. I mentioned it to my coworker Amber one day, trying to make it sound casual, but she picked up on my unease immediately. "That's weird," she said, frowning. "Like, every single day at the same time?" "Every single day I'm home, yeah. Weekends too." "Have you talked to him about it?" I hadn't. The thought of confronting him made my stomach turn. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, Gerald, could you stop standing at the fence and staring at my house every morning?" It sounded crazy when I thought about it that way. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just looking at birds. But deep down, I knew better. Something felt wrong. The thing that finally pushed me to investigate was what happened on a Saturday morning in late April. I'd worked a night shift and gotten home around 7 in the morning, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. I was in my bedroom, which faced the backyard, drawing the curtains closed when I saw him. Gerald was in his usual spot at the fence, but this time he wasn't staring at my back door. He was staring directly at my bedroom window, at me. We made eye contact for maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. He didn't look surprised or embarrassed at being caught. He just kept staring, his expression completely neutral, like I was an object he was cataloging. I yanked the curtain shut so fast I nearly pulled the rod down, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his face, that empty, watchful expression. I kept thinking about how long he'd been doing this, how many times I hadn't noticed. The idea that he'd been watching me for weeks, maybe even months, made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I did something I'm not proud of. I waited until I saw Gerald's car leave his driveway. He had a doctor's appointment every Saturday afternoon, I'd learned, and then I went into my backyard. I stood at the fence for a long moment, trying to work up the courage, and then I dragged a plastic lawn chair over and climbed up to look into his yard. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. From his side of the fence, at the exact spot where he stood every morning, the view was unobstructed. But it wasn't just a view of my back door. There was a step stool placed there, one of those small wooden ones positioned precisely to give him extra height. And on the ground next to it was a pair of binoculars, heavy-duty ones, the kind hunters use. They were sitting on top of a weathered notebook. My hands were shaking as I leaned further over the fence, trying to see what was in the notebook without actually going into his yard. I could just make out lined paper covered in handwritten notes. Times. Dates. I saw my name. I saw leaves for work, returns home, bedroom light on. He'd been documenting my schedule, every detail of my routine. How long I was gone, what time I came home, what rooms I used when I went to bed. Weeks and weeks of notes, maybe longer. I scrambled down from the chair so fast I nearly fell, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor was watching me from his own yard, that he was taking notes. It felt invasive and wrong, but I didn't know if it was actually illegal. I called Amber instead. She told me to document everything, take photos if I could, and to file a report with the police even if they couldn't do anything right away. Create a paper trail, she said. If he escalates one, you'll need it. That word, escalates, terrified me. I did take photos, leaning over the fence with my phone, my hands shaking so badly the pictures came out blurry. But you could see the step stool, the binoculars, the notebook with my name visible on the open page. When Gerald came home that evening, I stayed inside with all my curtains drawn and my doors locked. I heard him in his backyard, moving around, and I wondered if he knew I'd seen, if he knew I knew. I filed a police report the next day. The officer who took my statement was polite but didn't seem particularly concerned. He said unless Gerald had trespassed on my property or made threats, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I talk to Gerald directly, set boundaries. The thought made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. I never confronted him. Instead, I had a privacy fence installed 2 weeks later, 8 feet tall, solid panels with no gaps. It cost me $2,000 I didn't really have, but it was worth every penny. I stopped seeing Gerald at the fence line after that. I stopped feeling his eyes on me every morning. But here's the thing that still haunts me. About a month after I put up the new fence, I was taking out the trash and I found something tucked under my back doormat. A photograph. It was me in my bedroom, visible through the window before I'd started keeping the curtains closed all the time. I was in my pajamas, brushing my hair, completely unaware I was being watched. On the back of the photo, in careful handwriting, it said, "I can still see you. I moved out 3 months later. I broke my lease and lost my deposit, but I couldn't stay there. The house is still on the market, I think. Sometimes I wonder who lives there now and if Gerald is still standing at that fence every morning, watching and waiting. I wonder if they've noticed him yet." I'll never feel safe in a house with a backyard again. And I check every inch of my new apartment weekly, looking for cameras for any sign that someone is watching. Because now I know how long it can go on without you noticing. How someone can study every detail of your life from just a few feet away and you'll convince yourself it's nothing. That you're being paranoid. I wasn't paranoid, and I'll never ignore that instinct again. Story 2. They only came out at 3 a.m. I heard the door open at exactly 3:07 in the morning, and I knew they were going out to the yard again. This time I was ready. I had my phone in my hand, recording, pressed against the window frame so the camera could see into their backyard without me having to turn on any lights. What I captured that night still makes me check my doors 3 times before bed. The Hendersons moved into the house next door in September, right at the start of fall. It was a family of 4, mother, father, and 2 kids who looked to be around 8 and 10. They seemed completely normal, maybe even boring. The dad worked some kind of office job, always leaving in a suit at 7:30 in the morning. The mom was a teacher, I think. The kids caught the school bus at the corner. They were quiet neighbors, the kind you barely notice, which after my last neighbors, a college band that practiced at all hours, was a massive relief. My name is Connor, and I've always been a light sleeper. It's both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because I've never missed an alarm in my life. A curse because every sound, every creak, every car door in the neighborhood can wake me up. My bedroom window faces the Hendersons' backyard, separated by maybe 30 feet of grass and a chain-link fence. I usually kept my window cracked at night because I liked the fresh air, even as the weather got cooler. The first time I heard their back door open in the middle of the night, I didn't think much of it. It was maybe 2 weeks after they'd moved in. I glanced at my clock, 3:02 in the morning, and figured maybe one of them couldn't sleep. Or maybe someone had to let the dog out, except I'd never seen them with a dog. I heard footsteps on their wooden deck, then the sound of those steps going down into the grass, then nothing. After a few minutes, I drifted back to sleep. It happened again 3 nights later. Same time, almost to the minute. 3 a.m., back door opening, footsteps in the yard. This time I was awake enough to feel curious. I sat up and peeked through my blinds, but I couldn't see much. Their yard was dark and they didn't have any motion sensor lights. I could make out shapes moving near the back fence, but that was it. After about 20 minutes, I heard the footsteps return and the door close, then silence. By the 4th time it happened, I was fully awake the moment I heard the door. I checked my phone, 3:04 a.m. I got out of bed and went to the window, careful to stay in the darkness of my room. I could see 2 figures in their yard this time, both adults. They were near the back corner and I could hear the sound of metal on dirt. Digging. They were digging something. That's when my curiosity turned into something else, something closer to unease. I started setting a quiet alarm on my phone for 2:50 in the morning, just to see if it was really happening every night. And it was. Every single night at almost the exact same time, I'd hear that back door open. Sometimes it was just one person, sometimes it was both adults. And they were always digging. Different spots in the yard, but always digging. I never saw the kids out there, which was almost more disturbing. What kind of parents leave their children alone inside to go dig in the backyard at 3 in the morning? I mentioned it to my friend Kyle when he came over for a beer one Saturday. I tried to play it off as a weird quirk, but he picked up on my tone. "Every night?" he asked, frowning. "What the hell are they digging for?" "I have no idea. I thought maybe they were putting in a garden or something, but it's October. Who plants stuff in October? And at 3 in the morning?" Kyle shook his head. "Dude, that's weird. You think they're burying something?" The question hung in the air and I felt a chill run down my spine. Because yeah, that's exactly what it looked like. but what? And why? Maybe it's a pet cemetery thing, I suggested, trying to rationalize it. Maybe they keep losing pets and they're burying them in the yard. Kyle gave me a look that said he didn't buy that explanation any more than I did. After he left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started watching more carefully. I even went to the hardware store and bought a set of cheap binoculars so I could see better from my window. I felt creepy doing it, like I was becoming the weird neighbor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. On the night I finally got it on video, they were both out there, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. They'd set up a camping lantern that gave off a pale, greenish light. Mr. Henderson was digging while Mrs. Henderson stood nearby holding something. From my angle, I couldn't tell what it was at first. Something bundled in cloth about the size of a small suitcase or a large bag. I zoomed in with my phone camera as much as I could. The video was grainy and dark, but you could see them clearly enough. Mr. Henderson dug for maybe 15 minutes, creating a hole that looked about 3 feet deep. Then Mrs. Henderson handed him the bundle. He placed it carefully in the hole, almost reverently. And then they both stood there for a moment, heads bowed like they were praying. Then they filled the hole back in, patted down the dirt, and went inside. I sat on my bed, my hands shaking, watching the video over and over. What the hell was in that bundle? And why did they bury it with what looked like a ceremony? The next morning, I worked up the courage to do something I'd been avoiding. I went over to introduce myself properly, hoping I could feel out the situation, maybe get a sense of what was going on. Mrs. Henderson answered the door, and she was friendly enough, smiling, inviting me in for coffee. The house was immaculate, almost sterile. Everything in its place, no clutter, no personality. The kids were at school, she explained. Mr. Henderson was at work. We made small talk for a few minutes, and then I tried to casually bring it up. "I'm a pretty light sleeper," I said, laughing awkwardly. "I've noticed you folks are up pretty late sometimes. Hope everything's okay." Her smile didn't falter, but something changed in her eyes. A guardedness. "Oh, we're just night owls," she said breezily. "My husband has trouble sleeping sometimes, so he likes to garden, helps him relax." "At 3 in the morning?" I kept my tone light, joking. "Gardening is very meditative," she replied, and that was the end of the conversation. She politely but firmly walked me to the door a few minutes later. I left feeling more unsettled than before. Her explanation was bullshit, and we both knew it. You don't garden in the middle of the night in late October, and you definitely don't bury things wrapped in cloth if you're just planting seeds. I started researching. I know that sounds paranoid, but I couldn't help myself. I looked up the Hendersons online, trying to find any information about them. The thing is, I couldn't find much of anything. No social media profiles, no news articles, no history. It was like they'd just appeared out of nowhere. Then I made the mistake of checking the local news archives for the area they'd moved from. I found something that made my stomach drop. In their old neighborhood 2 years ago, 3 pets had gone missing in the span of a month, all from houses on their street. The cases were never solved. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was connecting dots that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living next to something dark. The breaking point came 3 weeks later on a freezing November night. I woke to the now familiar sound of their back door opening. 3 a.m. on the dot, but this time something was different. I heard a child's voice. One of the kids was outside with them. I rushed to the window and looked out. All 4 of them were in the backyard. The camping lantern was set up again, and Mr. Henderson was digging a new hole. But what made my blood run cold was what the older child was holding. It was a shoebox. And from the way the kid was holding it, cradling it carefully, I knew something was inside. The family gathered around the hole when it was deep enough. The child knelt down and placed the shoebox inside. Mrs. Henderson put her hand on the child's shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, that same prayer-like posture, and then Mr. Henderson filled in the hole. But here's the thing that made me finally call the police. As they were walking back to the house, the lantern light caught something at the edge of the yard, a row of small markers, the kind you'd use to label plants in a garden. Except these were lined up in neat rows at the back fence, maybe a dozen of them, each one marking a spot where they dug. I called the non-emergency line the next morning. I explained what I'd seen, sent them the video from my phone. The dispatcher was polite but skeptical. She said they'd send an officer to do a welfare check. I gave them my number and waited. 2 days later, an officer called me back. He said they'd spoken to the Henderson family, looked around the yard, and found nothing concerning. They're composting, he told me. They're into sustainable living. They bury their food scraps and things that decompose naturally. It's weird, but it's not illegal. At 3 in the morning? I asked. Sir, people have different schedules. Unless you have evidence of a crime, there's nothing we can do. I wanted to scream. Composting? Did they really expect me to believe that? But what could I say? What could I prove? Winter came and the nightly digging continued. Every single night, without fail, I'd hear that door open at 3 a.m. Sometimes I'd watch. Sometimes I'd just lie in bed listening, feeling this low-grade dread that never quite went away. In January, the Henderson kids stopped going to school. I noticed because I stopped seeing them wait for the bus. When I worked up the courage to ask Mrs. Henderson about it during another awkward front porch conversation, she said they'd switched to homeschooling. Her smile was pleasant, but her eyes were flat, empty. We just thought it would be better for them, she said. More focused attention. I nodded and left, feeling sick. I moved out in March. I couldn't take it anymore. The nightly sounds, the knowledge that something was happening next door and I couldn't stop it, couldn't even get anyone to take it seriously. I broke my lease and found an apartment on the other side of town. But before I left, I did one last thing. On my final night in that house, I waited until 4 a.m. after the Hendersons had gone back inside, and I climbed the fence into their backyard. I know I was trespassing. I know it was stupid. But I had to see what those markers were for. I pulled out one of the stakes. In the pale glow of my phone's flashlight, I read what was written on it in permanent marker. Rex, September 9th. I pulled out another one. Mittens, September 23rd. Another. Buddy, October 1st. They were names, pet names, and dates. I dug into the ground at the spot marked Rex, just a few inches down. My fingers hit something solid, fabric. I pulled it up, my heart racing, and unwrapped it enough to see. It was a dog collar, worn with a name tag that said Rex. But here's what made me run back to my house and lock every door and window. The collar was attached to something else. Something that looked like a bone. Small, white, clean. And I swear to God, it didn't look like it came from a dog. I left before dawn and never went back. I don't know what the Hendersons were doing, and part of me doesn't want to know. I told myself it was animal bones. Pet cemetery, just like I'd guessed. But I've worked in a hospital. I've seen bones, and what I touched that night keeps me up some nights wondering. The new tenants moved into my old house in April. I don't know them and I haven't tried to contact them, but sometimes I think about driving by, warning them somehow. Then I remember the way Mrs. Henderson looked at me that last time with those empty eyes, and I realize there's nothing I could say that would make them believe me. To this day, I can't sleep between 3 and 4 in the morning. I lie awake, listening to every sound, waiting for a door to open, waiting for the digging to start. And I never ever want to know what else they buried in that yard. Story 3. The apartment next door was always empty. The first time I heard footsteps through the wall, I checked the time on my phone. 1:37 in the morning. Heavy, deliberate steps like someone pacing back and forth. The sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. I pressed my hand against the shared wall and felt it, a dull vibration that confirmed someone was definitely in there. But according to my landlord, that apartment had been vacant for over a year. I'm Taylor, and I moved into apartment 2B at the Riverside Complex last April. It was an older building built sometime in the 70s with that kind of solid construction you don't find much anymore. Thick walls, heavy doors, high ceilings. The unit next to me, 2C, had been empty since before I moved in. The door was marked with a faded "for lease" sign, and whenever I passed it in the hallway, I noticed the layer of dust on the doorknob that suggested no one had touched it in months. My apartment was small but cozy, and the rent was reasonable. The location was perfect for my commute to the marketing firm where I worked. Everything seemed great for the first month. Quiet building, decent neighbors, no complaints. Then the sound started. At first, I thought it was coming from upstairs or maybe from outside. Old buildings make noise, I told myself. Pipes, settling foundations, all that stuff. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized the sounds were definitely coming from 2C. Always late at night, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning. Footsteps, the scrape of furniture. Sometimes what sounded like a door opening and closing inside the unit. After about a week of this, I mentioned it to my landlord when he came by to fix my kitchen sink. His name was Martin, a heavy-set guy in his 50s who'd owned the building for 20 years. "Someone's been in 2C at night," I told him. "I keep hearing people moving around in there." He gave me a strange look, somewhere between confused and uncomfortable. "That's not possible. That unit's been empty since last March. The previous tenant broke their lease and left. We haven't had anyone even look at it in months." "Are you sure? Because I hear someone in there almost every night." Martin frowned, wiped his hands on his work pants, and said he'd check it out. 20 minutes later, he knocked on my door and showed me photos on his phone. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing but bare walls and dusty floors. The layer of dust was thick and undisturbed, he pointed out. No footprints, no signs anyone had been inside. "See? Nobody's been in there. Maybe you're hearing the building settling or sounds from another unit echoing weird. These old places do that sometimes." I wanted to believe him. But that night, at 1:15 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of someone walking back and forth in 2C. Not the random creaks of a settling building. Distinct footsteps, rhythmic and purposeful like someone pacing. And then I heard something that made my skin crawl. A voice. Just a murmur too muffled to make out words, but definitely human. I got out of bed and pressed my ear against the wall. The voice continued, rising and falling like someone having a conversation. Except there was only one voice. No response, no second person. Just someone talking to themselves in an empty apartment. I grabbed my phone and called Martin. It went to voicemail. I almost called the police, but what would I say? I hear voices in an apartment that's supposedly empty. They'd think I was crazy. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, I did something impulsive. I went to 2C and tried the doorknob. It was locked. I knocked, half expecting someone to answer, but there was only silence. I crouched down and tried to look through the gap under the door, but all I could see was darkness. Later that day, I asked some of my neighbors if they'd heard anything strange from 2C. Mrs. Park from 2A, an elderly Korean woman who'd lived in the building for a decade, gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "That apartment has bad energy," she said quietly. "The woman who lived there before, she left very suddenly, middle of the night. I heard her crying, yelling. Then she was gone. Never came back. Do you know why she left?" Mrs. Park shook her head. She wouldn't talk to anyone, but I heard her sometimes through the wall, talking to someone, always talking, but she lived alone. A chill ran down my spine. Did you ever hear sounds from there after she left? Mrs. Park's expression darkened. Sometimes. Late at night. Footsteps. I told Martin, but he said I was imagining things. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I think someone lives there. Someone who isn't supposed to be there. That night, I decided to document what I was hearing. I set up my phone to record audio and placed it against the shared wall before going to bed. I woke up at 1:45 to the now familiar sounds, footsteps, furniture moving, that murmuring voice. I grabbed my phone and stopped the recording and then played it back. It was all there, crystal clear. Footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being dragged, and the voice clearer on the recording than it had been through the wall. It was a woman's voice, and she was saying the same thing over and over. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, please, I'm sorry. My hands were shaking as I listened. This wasn't my imagination, this wasn't the building settling. Someone was in that apartment and they were in distress. I called the police this time. 2 officers showed up around 3 in the morning. I played them the recording, and to their credit, they took it seriously. They went to 2C, knocked, announced themselves, and when no one answered, they called Martin to come open it up. We all stood in the hallway as Martin unlocked the door. The officers went in first, flashlights sweeping the darkness. I waited, my heart pounding, expecting them to find someone hiding in there, but they didn't. The apartment was completely empty, just like Martin had shown me in the photos. The officers checked every room, every closet, nothing. Just dust and bare walls. There's no one here, one of the officers told me. Are you sure the sounds are coming from this unit? I insisted they were, but I could see the skepticism in their faces. After they left, Martin pulled me aside. Look, I don't know what you're hearing, but there's nobody in that apartment. Maybe you should talk to someone. Stress can make you hear things that aren't there. I felt humiliated and confused, but I knew what I'd heard. I had proof on my phone. 2 nights later, I decided to watch 2C from outside the building. I sat in my car in the parking lot, positioned so I could see the windows of both my apartment and 2C. At 1:30 in the morning, I saw it. A light turned on in 2C. Not a bright light, more like the glow of a candle or a small lamp. It moved from room to room, visible through the thin gaps in the closed blinds. Someone was in there. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the light was gone. They checked the apartment again. Still empty, still nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. It was Mrs. Park who finally told me the truth about a week later. She knocked on my door one evening and asked if she could come in. She looked nervous, wringing her hands. I need to tell you something about 2C, she said. The woman who lived there before, her name was Sarah. She had a boyfriend who was not a good man. Very controlling. We heard them fighting sometimes. I listened, a sense of dread building in my chest. One night, about a year ago, there was a big fight. Lots of yelling, things breaking, then it got quiet, too quiet. The next day, Sarah was gone. Her boyfriend told Martin she'd moved out, taken all her things, but I never saw her leave. And her car stayed in the parking lot for 2 more days before he came and took it. You think something happened to her? Mrs. Park looked down at her hands. I don't know, but after she was gone, I started hearing things from that apartment. At night, footsteps, crying, like she was still there, trapped somehow. Did you tell the police? I tried. They looked for her, but her boyfriend said she'd left him, moved to another state. They couldn't prove anything. Eventually, they stopped looking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the wall, thinking about Sarah, thinking about what might have happened in that apartment. And then, at 1:30, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they stopped right at the shared wall, right where I was lying. And then I heard her voice, clearer than ever before, almost like she was in my room. "Help me, please, I can't leave." I bolted upright, my heart racing. I turned on every light in my apartment and didn't go near that wall for the rest of the night. I moved out 3 weeks later. I couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep, couldn't stand hearing those sounds night after night and knowing there was nothing I could do. The rational part of my brain said it was all just echoes, old building acoustics, my imagination running wild. But the rest of me knew better. Before I left, I went to 2C one last time. I stood outside the door and whispered, "I'm sorry, I tried." And from inside, so faint I almost missed it, I heard, "Thank you." I don't live at Riverside anymore, but sometimes I drive by late at night. The for lease sign is still on the door of 2C. It's been 2 years now, and according to the building website, that unit is still available. No one stays there long. I've checked. I think about Sarah sometimes, wondering if she's still there, still pacing those empty rooms, still apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. I think about calling the police again, demanding they search the walls, the floors, looking for what I'm terrified they'll find. But I don't, because part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me would rather believe she's somewhere else. That I imagined everything. But late at night, when my current apartment is quiet, I still hear her sometimes. A whisper at the edge of hearing. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And I wonder if some places hold on to pain so tightly that it never really leaves. Story 4. My neighbor's smile never changed. The first thing I noticed about her was her smile. It was perfect, bright, symmetrical. The kind of smile you'd see in a toothpaste commercial. She stood at the end of her driveway every morning at exactly 7:15, and when I'd drive past on my way to work, she'd wave with that same smile. Every single day. Same wave, same smile. For 3 months, I thought she was just friendly. Then I realized I'd never seen her face change. Not once. My name is Morgan, and I've lived on Ashwood Drive for about 2 years now. It's a suburban neighborhood, mostly young families and retirees, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and everyone waves. When the house next door sold last spring, I was curious about who'd be moving in. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years, and the house had needed work. The new neighbor moved in on a Saturday in May. I was mowing my lawn when the moving truck pulled up, and I saw her for the first time. She looked to be in her mid-30s, average height, with shoulder-length brown hair and that striking smile. She was alone. No moving crew. No family helping her. She carried boxes in one by one, moving with methodical efficiency. I walked over to introduce myself, being neighborly. "Hi, I'm Morgan. Welcome to the neighborhood." She turned to me, and that smile appeared, bright and instant. "Hello, Morgan. I'm Rebecca. It's wonderful to meet you." Her voice was pleasant but oddly flat, like she was reading from a script. We made small talk for a few minutes, where I worked, how long I'd lived there, basic neighbor stuff. The whole time, her smile never wavered, not even when I made a joke. She laughed, but it was the same bright smile, unchanged. I brushed it off. Some people just had naturally pleasant expressions. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing her routine. Every morning at 7:15, she'd be standing at the end of her driveway in the exact same spot, wearing the exact same outfit. Khaki pants and a blue cardigan. She'd wave at every car that passed, that same smile, that same gesture. At first, I thought she was just one of those morning people, aggressively cheerful. But then I started paying closer attention. She wore the same clothes every single day, the exact same outfit, same khaki pants, same blue cardigan, same white shoes. I started keeping track because it became so noticeable. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. the same clothes never varying. I mentioned it to my girlfriend Ashley one night. My neighbor wears the same outfit every day. Ashley looked up from her phone. Like the same style? No, I mean the exact same clothes, same pants, same sweater, for over a month now. That's weird. Maybe she has multiples of the same thing. Some people do that. Maybe. But it's not just that. It's everything. She stands in the same spot every morning at the exact same time. She smiles the exact same way. She waves the exact same way. It's like she's performing or something. Ashley gave me a look. You've been watching her pretty closely. I felt a flash of embarrassment. I'm not stalking her. It's just, you can't help but notice when something's off. But Ashley had a point. I was paying a lot of attention. Maybe too much. I tried to ignore it, to go about my routine without focusing on Rebecca. But once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. The thing that really started to bother me was that I never saw her go inside her house. I'd see her in the morning at 7:15 standing at the driveway. But I never saw her walk back to the house. She'd be there one moment, and then when I'd look again, after getting my coffee or checking my phone, she'd be gone. But I never actually saw her leave. And in the evening, I never saw her come home. No car pulled into the driveway, no lights turned on inside the house. The place looked empty, dark. But every morning at 7:15, there she was again. I started testing it. I'd watch from my window, coffee in hand, specifically looking for when she'd go back inside. But every single time I'd look away for just a second, to put down my mug, to grab my keys, to check the time. And when I looked back, she'd be gone. It was like she vanished the moment I wasn't looking directly at her. It started to creep me out. One morning, I decided to walk over and talk to her. Just a friendly conversation, maybe invite her to a neighborhood barbecue we were planning. As I approached, she turned to me with that smile. Good morning, Morgan. Beautiful day, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Hey, Rebecca, I was wondering, do you work from home? I never see you leave for work or anything. The smile didn't change. I keep to myself mostly. I prefer routine. Right, but do you leave the house? I've never seen you drive anywhere. I'm usually home. Her eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking. The smile held. Okay, but where do you go during the day? I mean, you're out here every morning, but then you're just gone. I never see you around. I'm usually home, she repeated, the exact same words, the exact same inflection. A chill ran down my spine. I mumbled something about the barbecue and backed away. The whole time she just stood there, smiling, watching me go. That night I did something I'm not proud of. I watched her house after dark. I sat by my window with the lights off, just observing. The house was completely dark. No lights, no movement, no signs of life. I stayed up until after midnight, but nothing changed. No lights ever turned on. Where was she? The next morning at 7:15, she was back in her spot. Same clothes, same smile, same wave. I started asking other neighbors about her. Most of them had noticed her, the woman who waved every morning, but none of them had actually spoken to her beyond a quick hello. And when I asked if anyone had ever seen her at any other time, getting groceries, checking her mail, anything, they all said no. She was just the woman who stood at the end of her driveway in the morning. She's harmless, one neighbor said, just quirky. But harmless people don't wear the same clothes for 3 straight months. Harmless people don't stand in the exact same spot every morning like clockwork and then vanish without ever being seen going anywhere. I decided to check her house more closely. One afternoon when she wasn't at the driveway because she was never there except for that precise morning window, I walked over and looked through her front window. The curtains were partially open and I could see inside. The house was empty, not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture, no boxes, nothing, just bare walls and dusty floors exactly the way it had been before she moved in. My blood went cold. Where were all those boxes she'd carried in on moving day? Where was her furniture, her belongings, her life? I walked around to the back of the house and peered through another window. Same thing, completely empty, like no one had ever lived there at all. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about that smile, that unchanging smile, the same clothes, the same spot, the same wave. What was she? Why was she doing this? The next morning I didn't go to work. I stayed home specifically to watch what happened. At 7:10 I positioned myself by my front window with a clear view of her driveway. I didn't look away, not for a second. At exactly 7:15 she appeared. Not walked up, not came out of the house, she just appeared. 1 second the driveway was empty, and the next second she was standing there in her spot, smiling, waiting. I felt like I might throw up. That wasn't possible. People don't just appear. But I'd been watching, and I hadn't seen her approach from any direction. I watched her for the next hour, never looking away. She stood perfectly still, smiling, occasionally waving at passing cars. At 8:15, she turned and walked toward her house. I kept my eyes locked on her, determined to see where she went. She reached the front door, opened it. I heard the sound from my window and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. I immediately ran over to her house and looked through the front window again. The house was empty. No Rebecca, no furniture, nothing. And when I tried the front door, it was locked. I called the police that afternoon. I told them everything, the empty house, the same clothes, the way she appeared and disappeared. I could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice, but she said she'd send someone to check it out. 2 officers came by that evening. They knocked on Rebecca's door. No answer. They walked around the house, peered through the windows like I had. Then they came to talk to me. "The house appears vacant, sir. Are you sure someone's living there?" "She's there every morning, 7:15, like clockwork." "Well, there's no one there now, and it doesn't look like anyone's living there at all. Maybe you saw a real estate agent or someone checking on the property." "For 3 months? Every single day?" They exchanged looks. One of them suggested I might want to talk to someone, get some rest. They left, and I felt like I was going crazy. But the next morning at 7:15, Rebecca was there. Same spot, same smile, same wave. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched over to her, my hands shaking. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" She turned to me, that smile unchanging. "Hello, Morgan. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Stop it. Stop with the act. I know you don't live here. I've seen inside. The house is empty. Where do you go? What do you want?" Her head tilted slightly, and for the first time, her expression changed. The smile widened, just a fraction, stretching her face in a way that looked wrong. Inhuman. "I'm usually home, Morgan." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. Her eyes were still locked on mine, unblinking. And that smile kept stretching wider and wider until it looked like her face might split in half. I ran. I ran back to my house, locked every door and window, closed all the curtains. I called Ashley, told her I was coming to stay at her place for a while. She asked what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. I just packed a bag and left. I haven't been back to my house in over a month. It's on the market now. I'm selling it at a loss because I can't stand the thought of going back there. But here's what keeps me up at night. Last week, Ashley mentioned that there's a woman who stands at the end of her street every morning. Always at the same time, always waving, always smiling. She's wearing khaki pants and a blue cardigan. I haven't told Ashley to stop waving back. What would I even say? Would she believe me? I don't think Rebecca, or whatever she is done with me. I think she's following me. I think wherever I go, eventually I'll see her standing at the end of the driveway at 7:15, wearing that same smile. And one day I'm afraid I'll look too long and she'll stop pretending to be human. Story 5. The family next door had too many children. I counted 3 kids the day they moved in. 2 boys and a girl running around the front yard while their parents unloaded boxes. By the end of the week, there were 4 children. A week after that, 5. I kept telling myself I'd miscounted, that maybe cousins were visiting. But the children never left. And when I finally asked their mother about it, she looked at me with eyes that had no light in them and said, "What children?" That's when I knew I had to get out of there before I ended up just like them. My name is Blake, and I moved to Sycamore Street in August, looking for a quiet suburban neighborhood to start over after my divorce. The house was perfect. 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, friendly neighbors. The house next door had been vacant for a few months, according to my realtor, but someone had just put in an offer. I figured having neighbors with kids might be nice, maybe add some life to the street. The Morrison family moved in on a Saturday morning. I was out front watering my plants when the moving truck arrived. The parents looked normal enough. Dad in his early 40s, Mom maybe late 30s, both dressed in jeans and t-shirts. And the kids. I specifically remember counting them because I was trying to gauge how loud my new neighbors might be. 2 boys, probably around 6 and 8 years old, and 1 girl who looked about 10. They were well-behaved, helping carry small boxes, laughing as they explored the yard. I waved to the parents, and the father waved back with a friendly smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I called out. "Thanks," he replied. "I'm David, this is my wife Karen and our kids." I didn't think anything was strange at first. They seemed like a typical family, maybe a little quiet, a little reserved, but nothing alarming. Over the next few days, I'd see them occasionally. The kids would play in the backyard, and I'd hear their laughter through the fence. Normal stuff. It was about 5 days after they moved in when I noticed the 4th child. I was taking out the trash in the early evening when I saw 4 kids in their backyard instead of 3. 2 boys and 2 girls this time. They were playing on a swing set that the parents must have just installed. I stood there for a moment, confused. Had there always been 4 kids? I could have sworn I'd only seen 3 on moving day. But maybe 1 had been inside the house, or maybe I'd just miscounted. Kids move around a lot. It's easy to lose track. I mentioned it to my coworker Rachel the next day, trying to laugh it off. "I think I'm losing it. I could have sworn my new neighbors had 3 kids, but yesterday I counted 4. Rachel shrugged. "Maybe a friend was over, or maybe you just didn't get a good look the first time." That made sense. I dropped it. But then, less than a week later, I counted 5 children. I was absolutely certain this time. I stood at my kitchen window with my morning coffee, specifically paying attention because I was still puzzled by the earlier discrepancy. 5 kids, 2 older boys, 2 younger girls, and 1 middle-aged child who looked about 9. This time I knew something was off. Families don't just gain children every few days. I watched them more carefully over the next week, trying to figure out what was happening. Were they fostering? Running a daycare? But the kids never left. No parents came to pick them up. They were always there, playing in the yard, visible through the windows. And there was something else that bothered me. The children never went to school. It was September by now, school was definitely in session. But every morning those kids were in the backyard or visible through the windows. All day, every day. I decided to introduce myself properly and maybe fish for information. On a Sunday afternoon, I baked some cookies, trying to be a good neighbor, and walked over to their house. Karen answered the door, that same pleasant but distant smile on her face. "Hi, I'm Blake from next door. Just wanted to bring these over and officially welcome you to the neighborhood." "How thoughtful," she said, taking the plate of cookies. "Thank you." I tried to peer past her into the house, but she stood in the doorway, blocking my view. "So you've got quite a full house. How many kids do you have?" Her smile didn't change. "We're very blessed. It must be a handful. Do they go to the local elementary school?" "We homeschool. It's better for them." "Oh, that's great. How many are you homeschooling? I've seen them playing outside. Seems like a lot of energy to manage." Her expression flickered for just a moment, something passing behind her eyes that I couldn't identify. "We manage just fine. Is there anything else?" The conversation ended abruptly. She closed the door before I could respond, leaving me standing on the porch feeling distinctly unwelcome. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that moment when I'd asked how many kids she had. She hadn't answered. She just said they were blessed. What kind of non-answer was that? At around 2 in the morning, I got up to get some water and glanced out my bedroom window, which faced their house. There were lights on inside, and I could see silhouettes moving past the windows. Small silhouettes. Children. Up and moving around at 2 in the morning. I started keeping track. I know it sounds obsessive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I'd count the kids every time I saw them. By mid-September, there were 6 children. By the end of September, 7. The children never left the property, not once. No walks around the neighborhood, no trips to the park, no getting into the family car. They just stayed in that house and that yard, always visible, always playing the same quiet games. I asked other neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange about the Morrison family. Most people hadn't paid much attention. "They keep to themselves," one neighbor said, "but they seem nice enough." "Have you noticed how many kids they have?" The neighbor thought for a moment. "A few? I don't know. I haven't really counted." But I had counted. I'd been counting obsessively, and the number kept growing. In early October, I saw 8 children in the backyard. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't me miscounting. Something was happening next door, something impossible, and no one else seemed to notice or care. I decided to call Child Protective Services. I didn't have concrete evidence of abuse, but something was wrong. Children don't just multiply. Families don't hide 8 kids in a house and never let them leave. The CPS worker I spoke to was patient but skeptical. "So you're reporting that your neighbors have too many children?" "It's not just that. The kids never leave the house, they don't go to school, they don't play with other kids, they're up in the middle of the night. And the parents won't tell me how many children they actually have." "Sir, homeschooling is legal and families are allowed to keep to themselves, unless you have evidence of actual abuse or neglect. The number of children keeps increasing. There were 3 when they moved in, and now there are 8. There was a pause. "I'll make a note of your concern and someone will do a welfare check. But I have to be honest, what you're describing doesn't constitute an emergency." A caseworker came by 3 days later. I watched from my window as she knocked on the Morrisons' door. Karen answered. They spoke for a few minutes and then the caseworker went inside. She was in there for maybe 20 minutes before coming back out. She stopped by my house afterward. I spoke with the family. Everything seems fine. The children appear healthy and well cared for. The home is clean and safe. "How many children did you see?" She consulted her notes. 3. 2 boys and a girl. My stomach dropped. 3? Are you sure? "Yes, sir. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have 3 children. They're homeschooled, which is perfectly legal. I saw no evidence of any other children in the home." After she left, I felt like I was losing my mind. I'd seen 8 children just 2 days ago. 8. Where were the other 5? That night, I did something desperate. I waited until after midnight, then crept over to their property and looked through their ground floor windows. I had to know. I had to see what was really going on in there. The first window I looked through showed what appeared to be a living room. Normal furniture, toys scattered on the floor, a TV playing quietly. Nothing strange. The second window was a dining room. There was a long table with chairs, and on the table were plates, lots of plates. I counted them. 11 plates, arranged as if for a meal. My heart was racing. I moved to the next window, which looked into what must have been a playroom. And that's where I saw them. Children. So many children. More than 8. Maybe 12 or 15, it was hard to tell because they were all sitting on the floor in a circle, completely silent, completely still. Just sitting there in the dark, not moving, not playing, not making a sound. I stumbled backward and nearly fell. What the hell was happening in that house? I ran back to my house and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my living room with the lights on, trying to decide what to do. The next morning, I worked up the courage to confront them directly. I marched over and pounded on their door. David answered this time, looking annoyed. "Can I help you? What the hell is going on in your house? How many kids do you have in there?" His expression darkened. "I think you need to mind your own business. There are too many children in there. Where did they come from? Are they safe? You need to leave now, before I call the police. Call them, please call them, because something is wrong here and someone needs to." The door slammed in my face. I stood there, shaking with anger and fear, and then I noticed something. A child's face in the upstairs window watching me. Pale, expressionless, just staring. Then another face appeared beside it, and another. Within seconds, there were 6 faces pressed against that window, all staring down at me with blank, empty eyes. I ran. I called the police myself that afternoon. I told them everything. The increasing number of children, the CPS visit that found only 3 kids, what I'd seen through the window the night before. The officer who responded was professional, but clearly thought I was either lying or mentally unstable. "Sir, we can't enter someone's home without probable cause. The family has already been cleared by CPS. Unless you have evidence of a crime. There are 15 children in that house. That's not normal. Something is happening to those kids. Do you have proof? Photos? Video?" I didn't. I'd been too shocked, too scared to think about documenting what I'd seen. The officer left and I felt completely helpless. Over the next week, I stopped seeing children in the backyard. The house became quiet, the curtains stayed drawn. But at night, I'd see lights moving inside, shadows passing by the windows, and sometimes, if I listened carefully, I could hear children's voices. Singing, maybe, or chanting. Something rhythmic and disturbing that made my skin crawl. I put my house on the market at the end of October. I couldn't stay there anymore. My realtor asked why I was selling so quickly, and I didn't know what to tell her. That my neighbors were collecting children? That I'd seen too many faces in the window? She'd think I was crazy. The day before I moved out, I saw Karen in her driveway. I don't know what possessed me, but I walked over one last time. "How many children do you have?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Just tell me the truth. How many?" She turned to me with that same pleasant smile. But her eyes were empty, like something had been hollowed out from behind them. "What children?" she said. And then she went inside and closed the door. I moved out the next day and never went back. I've tried to find information about the Morrison family online, but there's nothing. No social media, no records, nothing. It's like they don't exist outside of that house on Sycamore Street. Sometimes I have nightmares about those faces in the window, all those blank staring faces. I dream about how many children might be in that house now. 20? 30? More? And I think about Karen's question, what children? And I wonder if maybe she really didn't see them anymore. If maybe whatever was happening in that house had taken something from her too. The ability to see what was right in front of her eyes. I don't live on Sycamore Street anymore, but I still check the property records online sometimes. The house is still owned by David and Karen Morrison, still occupied. And I imagine those children, however many there are now, sitting in silent circles in the dark, waiting for something I'm grateful I never discovered. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some neighbors are better left alone. But I'll never forget those faces in the window, multiplying every time I looked. Story 6. He knew things he shouldn't know. He mentioned it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. You stayed up pretty late last night, didn't you? I heard you watching that documentary about the ocean. I froze with my coffee cup halfway to my lips. I had watched a documentary the night before, but my TV was in my bedroom with the windows closed and the curtains drawn. There was no way he could have heard it. That's when I started tearing my apartment apart, looking for what I knew had to be there. My name is Garrett, and I lived in a small apartment complex in the suburbs, the kind of place where everyone pretty much keeps to themselves. It was affordable, quiet, and close to my job as a graphic designer for a marketing company. I'd been there about 8 months when Paul moved into the unit next to mine. He seemed normal at first, mid-30s, worked from home doing something with computers, IT consulting or programming, he'd said vaguely when we met in the hallway. He was friendly in that casual neighbor way, making small talk about the weather or the building's occasionally spotty Wi-Fi. We'd exchange pleasantries when we ran into each other at the mailboxes or in the parking lot, but nothing beyond surface-level conversation. The comments started about 3 weeks after he moved in. I was coming home from the gym one evening, still in my workout clothes, and I ran into Paul in the stairwell. He smiled and said, "Good workout? You've been really consistent lately, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, right?" I laughed, assuming he'd just noticed my pattern of leaving early on those days. "Yeah, trying to stick to a routine." "That's great. Consistency is key." It was a normal exchange. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But looking back, that was the first sign that Paul was paying attention to my schedule in a way that went beyond casual neighborly awareness. A few days later, I was checking my mail when Paul appeared beside me. "Hey Garrett, how was that Thai place you ordered from last night? I've been thinking about trying it." I turned to him smiling. "It was good, actually. The pad Thai was..." And then I stopped. Wait. How did he know I'd ordered Thai food? I'd ordered delivery through an app and it was dropped off at my door. I hadn't seen Paul the night before. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "How'd you know I got Thai food?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He barely hesitated. "Oh, I saw the delivery guy. The bag had the restaurant logo on it." That seemed reasonable enough. The delivery person would have walked past his door to get to mine. I let it slide, but the comments continued, getting more specific, more frequent. "Looks like you're working on a big project. Saw your light on past midnight 3 days in a row. That horror movie you watched last night was intense, huh?" I could hear some of the screaming through the walls. "You've been going to bed later lately. Everything okay?" Each comment individually seemed innocent enough, the observations of a neighbor who happened to notice things. But together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Paul knew too much about my routine, my habits, things that shouldn't have been visible to a neighbor just living his life next door. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was leaving for work when I ran into Paul in the parking lot. He was getting something from his car and he looked up when he saw me. "Morning, Garrett. You stayed up pretty late last night, didn't you?" He said it casually, like he was making polite conversation. "I heard you watching that documentary about the ocean. The coral reefs one. Pretty fascinating stuff. I felt my blood run cold. I had watched a documentary the night before about coral reefs and marine biology. But I'd watched it in my bedroom on my laptop with headphones on because it was after 11 and I didn't want to disturb anyone. The windows were closed, the curtains were drawn. There was absolutely no way he could have heard it. "How did you know what I was watching?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Paul looked surprised at my tone. "Oh, I guess I heard it through the wall. These apartments aren't exactly soundproof." I was wearing headphones. There was a pause. His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Calculation, maybe. Or realization that he'd made a mistake. "Must have been earlier then, before you put the headphones on." He shrugged. "Sorry, I'm probably misremembering. I heard something about oceans and just assumed." He got into his car and drove off before I could respond, leaving me standing in the parking lot with a growing sense of dread. I called in sick to work and went back to my apartment. I stood in the middle of my living room looking around, really seeing the space for the first time in months. If Paul knew what I was watching on my laptop with headphones on in my bedroom with the curtains closed, there was only one explanation. He had a camera in my apartment. My hands were shaking as I started searching. I didn't really know what I was looking for. I'd seen enough spy movies to know that hidden cameras could be tiny, disguised as anything. But I had to try. I started with the obvious places: smoke detectors, wall outlets, picture frames. Nothing. I searched for 3 hours, taking apart everything I could, checking every object, every piece of furniture. I was about to give up, convinced I was being paranoid, when I found the first one. It was in my bedroom, hidden inside a digital alarm clock that sat on my nightstand. I'd bought the clock at a thrift store a few months ago, right around the time Paul had moved in. I'd never thought twice about it. I took the clock apart with a screwdriver, and there it was. A tiny camera lens, no bigger than a pencil eraser, embedded in the display panel. My stomach turned. I dismantled the clock completely, my hands shaking, and pulled out the camera. It was wireless, battery-powered, sophisticated. This wasn't some cheap spy equipment. This was high-end surveillance gear. I found the second camera in my living room inside a smoke detector that I'd assumed was original to the apartment. It wasn't. Someone had replaced the real smoke detector with one that had a camera hidden inside. From its angle, it had a clear view of my entire living room, including my couch where I spent most of my time. I found the third camera in my bathroom. That one made me feel physically sick. It was hidden in the vent above the shower, pointed directly at the bathing area. By the time I stopped searching, I'd found 5 cameras total. Bedroom, living room, bathroom, kitchen, and one in the entryway pointed at my front door. My entire apartment had been under surveillance. I sat on my couch, surrounded by the disassembled electronics, trying not to panic. Paul had been watching me. For weeks, maybe months. He'd seen everything. Every moment I thought I was alone and private, he'd been watching. The comments made sense now. He knew my schedule because he watched me leave and return. He knew what I ate because he saw me in the kitchen. He knew what I watched because he could see my TV and laptop screens. He'd been documenting my entire life. I called the police. 2 officers came to my apartment and I showed them the cameras I'd found. They took my statement, bagged the cameras as evidence, and said they'd investigate. They went to Paul's apartment, but he wasn't home. His car was gone. "We'll follow up with him," one officer told me. "In the meantime, we recommend you stay somewhere else until we can sort this out." I stayed with my friend Marcus that night. I couldn't stand the thought of being in my apartment, knowing Paul had been watching me there for God knows how long. The police called me the next day with an update that made everything worse. When they'd finally contacted Paul, he denied everything. He said he'd never been in my apartment, never installed any cameras. He suggested maybe I'd been hacked, that someone could have installed cameras remotely or during a previous tenancy. His story was calm, reasonable, completely cooperative. And here's the thing that made my blood boil. Without proof that he specifically had installed the cameras, the police couldn't charge him with anything. The cameras themselves didn't have his fingerprints. He'd been too careful. His internet history, which they'd need a warrant to search thoroughly, would take time to access. They told me to get a restraining order to document any further contact, but essentially their hands were tied. Paul moved out 3 days later, just packed up and left in the middle of the night. When I went back to my apartment, I had every lock changed, every smoke detector and electrical outlet checked by professionals. I bought a bug detector online and swept my apartment weekly for months. But here's what haunts me. Before he left, Paul slipped a note under my door. I found it when I came back to grab some clothes. It was handwritten, just a few words. I enjoyed getting to know you. I moved out a month later. Broke my lease, lost my deposit, didn't care. I couldn't stay in that apartment knowing what had happened there, knowing that someone had watched my most private moments. I'm in a new place now, a different part of town. I don't have any electronics I didn't buy myself, brand new from a store. I check my apartment for cameras once a week, sometimes more. I keep my curtains closed even during the day. I don't make small talk with my neighbors because I'm terrified that one of them might be doing the same thing Paul did. The worst part is not knowing how long it had been going on. The cameras I found had internal storage, but by the time I discovered them, the files had been remotely wiped. I don't know what he saw, what he recorded, what he might still have saved somewhere. Sometimes I get emails from addresses I don't recognize. No message, just a subject line. I'm still watching. I've changed my email 3 times, but they keep finding me. The police say there's nothing they can do without being able to trace the sender. I don't know where Paul is now. The police told me he left the state, but they lost track of him after that. No forwarding address, no new job on record, nothing. He just vanished. And every time I meet someone new, every time a neighbor says hello or comments on my routine, I feel that same cold dread. Because Paul seemed normal too at first. Just a friendly guy who paid attention. Too much attention. I'll never feel truly alone again. Even now, in my new apartment with all my precautions, part of me wonders if there's a camera I missed, a lens I can't see, someone watching and waiting. That's what Paul took from me. Not just my privacy, but my ability to ever feel secure in my own space. And that's a theft you can never fully recover from. Story 7. The house next door was condemned for a reason. The first time I found a photograph in my yard, I thought it was trash that had blown over from somewhere else. It was old, maybe from the 70s, showing a family of 4 standing in front of a house. I flipped it over and saw a date written in faded ink, July 12, 1974. Then I looked at the house in the photo and realized it was the condemned house next door, except it looked pristine, well kept, alive. That's when I started finding the other things. My name is Austin, and I bought my house on Elmwood Drive last March. It was a foreclosure, a steal for the price, and while it needed some cosmetic work, the bones were solid. The real estate agent had been upfront about one thing. The property next door was condemned and had been sitting empty for nearly 15 years. The house was a 2-story colonial that must have been beautiful once, but time and neglect had turned it into something out of a horror movie. The windows were boarded up, the white paint had peeled away to reveal rotting wood underneath, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that had to be waist-high. There was a rusted chain across the front gate with a no trespassing and condemned property signs hanging from it. What's the story with that place? I'd asked my agent during the walkthrough. She'd hesitated before answering, which should have been my first clue. It's been tied up in legal issues for years. Something about the property ownership being disputed. The city's been trying to tear it down, but there's been resistance from someone. I'm not entirely sure of the details. Has anyone tried to develop it? A few investors have looked at the lot, but no one's followed through. I think the history of the place puts people off. What history? She shrugged uncomfortably. Just rumors. You know how people talk. I didn't push it. The condemned house didn't really affect me. It was an eyesore, sure, but my property was nice enough, and the price was right. I moved in 2 weeks later and started settling into my new life as a homeowner. The first photograph appeared about 3 weeks after I moved in. I was mowing my lawn when I spotted it near the fence line that separated my property from the condemned house. It was face down in the grass, partially covered by dirt. I picked it up, brushed it off, and examined it. The photo showed a family, mother, father, a teenage boy, and a younger girl, standing in front of what I immediately recognized as the house next door. But in the photo, the house looked perfect. Fresh paint, manicured lawn, flowers in the window boxes. The family was smiling, posed in that formal way people used to stand for photographs. On the back, written in careful cursive, "The Hendricks family, July 12, 1974. I assumed it was just old trash, maybe something that had been in the yard for years and got unearthed by rain or wind. I tossed it in my garbage and didn't think much more about it. But then I found a toy. It was a small metal car, the kind kids played with decades ago, rusted and covered in dirt. It was sitting on my back porch steps when I came home from work one evening. I definitely hadn't left it there, and I couldn't figure out how it had gotten there. The car looked ancient, like it had been buried and recently dug up. Over the next few weeks, more objects appeared, always in my yard or on my porch. Always old, always connected somehow to the past. A child's shoe, small and worn, a hairbrush with a few strands of gray hair still caught in the bristles, a keychain with the initials JH, a rotted teddy bear with one eye missing. Each item felt like it had been deliberately placed, not randomly blown in by the wind, and they all had that same quality, ancient, weathered, like they'd been underground for years. I asked my neighbors if they knew anything about objects appearing in yards. Maybe kids playing pranks or someone cleaning out the condemned house. Most people didn't want to talk about the house next door at all. "Just ignore it," one older neighbor said. "That place has been trouble since before you were born. Best to leave it alone." But one neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Chen who'd lived on the street for 40 years, was more forthcoming. "The Hendricks family," she said when I described the photograph I'd found. "They lived there in the 70s. Nice family, kept to themselves. Then one day they just disappeared. All 4 of them, no one ever found out what happened." "Disappeared," she nodded. "The father didn't show up to work. The kids weren't at school. Neighbors noticed the newspapers piling up, so someone called the police. When they went inside, the house was empty. Dinner was still on the table, half eaten. Their car was in the garage, but the family was gone, just vanished." A chill ran down my spine. "They never found them?" "Never. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no signs of them anywhere. It was like they evaporated. The house sat empty for years after that. Eventually, the city condemned it because it was falling apart and no one could figure out who legally owned the property. The Hendricks family's extended relatives didn't want anything to do with it." "Why not?" Mrs. Chen's expression darkened. "Because people started seeing things. Lights in the windows at night, even though there's no electricity, shadows moving inside. Some people claimed they heard children laughing. The house got a reputation. After a while, people just avoided it." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Hendricks family, about the photograph, about all the objects appearing in my yard. At around 2 in the morning, I got up to get some water and glanced out my kitchen window, which faced the condemned house. There was a light on inside, a faint flickering glow like a candle, moving from window to window on the second floor. My heart started pounding. I stood there watching for maybe 10 minutes as the light moved slowly through the house, appearing in one window, disappearing, then appearing in another. There was no electricity in that house. It had been cut off years ago. I called the police to report a possible intruder. 2 officers came out, checked the property, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been inside. The boards on the windows were still secure. "You sure you saw a light?" one officer asked me, skeptical. "I'm sure. Could have been a reflection from a car or something. Light plays tricks sometimes." They left and I felt foolish. But I knew what I'd seen. The objects kept appearing, and now they came more frequently. Almost every day I'd find something new. A piece of clothing, a broken plate, a rusted knife, a children's book so water-damaged the pages were stuck together. And then I started finding them inside my house. I came home from work one Thursday to find a small porcelain doll sitting on my kitchen counter. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it there. All my doors and windows were locked. But there it was, staring at me with glassy eyes, its clothing rotted and falling apart. I grabbed the doll and threw it in the outdoor trash. I checked every lock, every window, everything was secure. But the next day, the doll was back, sitting on my couch this time. I was starting to lose it. Something was getting into my house, leaving these objects, and I couldn't figure out how or why. On a cold night in October, I woke to the sound of children laughing. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The laughter was coming from outside, from the direction of the condemned house. I got out of bed and looked out my window. The house was dark, but I could see movement in the overgrown yard. Small figures, maybe 2 or 3 of them, running and playing. Children. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. I know it was stupid, but I had to see, I had to understand what was happening. I climbed over the fence into the condemned property's yard, the weeds brushing against my legs, and approached the house. The laughter had stopped, but I could still feel a presence, like I was being watched. The front door was boarded up, but one of the boards had rotted away enough that I could squeeze through. I pushed my way inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was a wreck. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, debris everywhere. It smelled like rot and mildew. But there were signs that someone or something had been there recently. Footprints in the dust, small footprints, child-sized. I followed them through the house, my hands shaking, until I reached the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and from below I could hear a sound. Not laughter this time. Whispering. Dozens of voices, whispering all at once, overlapping, incomprehensible. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I opened the door wider and shone my flashlight down the stairs. The whispering stopped instantly. At the bottom of the stairs, arranged in a neat circle, were dozens of objects. Toys, photographs, pieces of clothing, all old, all weathered. And in the center of the circle was a trap door in the floor, partially open. I could smell it even from where I stood, the unmistakable smell of decay, of death. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside my own house with every door locked. I called the police again, told them what I'd found. This time they took it seriously. They sent officers to investigate the basement. What they found made the news. Beneath the trapdoor were the remains of 4 people. The Hendricks family, buried in a shallow grave beneath their own house for nearly 50 years. The forensic analysis suggested they'd been killed, blunt force trauma to the skulls, and hidden there by someone who'd then simply walked away. The case is still technically unsolved. No one knows who killed them or why. But the house is finally being torn down. The city approved the demolition after the bodies were found. I should feel relieved. But here's the thing. After the remains were removed and the house was scheduled for demolition, the objects stopped appearing in my yard. But I still see them sometimes. The children. Late at night in my peripheral vision, standing at the edge of my property watching. They don't come closer, they just watch. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear it again. That laughter. Those small footsteps in my yard. The sound of something being placed gently on my porch. I don't go outside to check anymore. I just wait until morning, and by then whatever was left is always gone. But I know they're still there. The Hendricks children, and maybe others, still trapped somehow to the place where they died. The house is gone now, reduced to rubble and an empty lot. But I don't think that matters to them. I think they've been reaching out for decades, trying to tell someone what happened, leaving pieces of their lives behind like breadcrumbs. And I was the first person to actually notice, to actually listen. I'm thinking of moving, selling the house and leaving Elmwood Drive behind. But part of me wonders if it would even matter, if the children would follow me, or if they're bound to that lot forever waiting for someone to remember them. Either way, I'll never forget the sound of their laughter in the dark, or the feeling of being watched by eyes that haven't been alive for 50 years. Story 8. My neighbor buried something in his yard. Every week. I noticed it by accident one October night when I couldn't sleep. I was standing at my bedroom window with a glass of water, looking out at nothing in particular, when I saw my neighbor in his backyard with a shovel. He was digging near the back fence, illuminated by a work light he'd set up on a stand. It was just past midnight. He dug for maybe an hour, lowered something wrapped in black plastic into the hole, filled it back in, and went inside. I figured it was weird, but not my business. That was before I realized he did it every single week. My name is Travis, and I lived in a quiet subdivision on the edge of town, the kind of place where everyone has a quarter-acre lot and privacy fences. My neighbor Richard had lived next door for about 5 years before I moved in. He was in his late 50s, divorced, worked as an accountant. We'd wave when we saw each other, but never had more than surface-level conversations. He kept to himself, which was fine by me. The first time I saw him digging, I chalked it up to a gardening project. Some people work in their yards at odd hours, especially if they have demanding day jobs. But I'm a chronic insomniac, and over the next few weeks I started noticing a pattern. Every Saturday night around midnight, I'd hear the sound of digging. I'd look out my window and there would be Richard in his backyard with his shovel and work light digging a new hole. It was methodical. He'd dig for about an hour, creating a hole maybe 3 feet deep. Then he'd go into his garage and come back carrying something wrapped in black plastic sheeting, roughly the size of a large duffel bag. He'd place it carefully in the hole, fill it back in and tamp down the dirt. Then he'd pack up his light and go inside, every Saturday night, like clockwork. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was burying compost or yard waste. Maybe he had some kind of elaborate gardening system I didn't understand. But who buries things in plastic sheeting? And why always at midnight? Why not during the day when it would be easier to see? After about a month of this, my curiosity got the better of me. One Sunday morning, I casually went into my backyard and looked over the fence into Richard's yard. I could see the spots where he'd been digging. Multiple locations all near the back fence and side perimeter. The dirt looked freshly turned, though he'd tried to cover the areas with leaves and debris. I counted at least 8 distinct spots, maybe more. I mentioned it to my girlfriend Ashley when she came over that weekend. My neighbor's been burying stuff in his yard every Saturday night, like clockwork. She looked at me like I was crazy. Burying what? I don't know, it's wrapped in plastic, big bundles. That's weird. Maybe ask him about it? But I couldn't imagine that conversation. Hey Richard, I've been watching you dig holes in your yard at midnight. What's up with that? It sounded insane, and honestly, I was a little afraid to know the answer. Instead, I started keeping a log. I know that sounds obsessive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every Saturday, I'd note what time he started digging, approximately where in the yard he dug, how long it took, and the size of what he buried. The locations varied, but everything else was remarkably consistent. Always midnight, always about an hour of digging, always a similar-sized bundle. By December, I'd documented 12 burials, 12 separate holes in his backyard, each containing something wrapped in plastic. Winter came, and I thought maybe he'd stop. Frozen ground would make digging harder. But he didn't stop. I watched him out there in January, breath fogging in the cold air, working a pickaxe to break through the frozen soil before switching to the shovel. Whatever he was burying, he was committed to the schedule. I started having dark thoughts. The bundles were the right size to be bodies, or parts of bodies. I felt sick every time the thought crossed my mind, but I couldn't ignore it. What else would someone bury secretly, regularly, in the middle of the night? I searched online for news of missing persons in our area. I found a few cases. A missing college student from 2 towns over, a woman who disappeared after a night out, but nothing that seemed connected to Richard or our neighborhood. Still, the thought nagged at me. In March, I did something I'm not proud of. I waited until Richard's car left the driveway one Saturday afternoon. He usually went out for groceries around that time, and I climbed the fence into his yard. I knew it was trespassing, knew I could get in serious trouble, but I had to see. The spots where he'd been digging were obvious once you knew what to look for. Slightly sunken areas where the dirt had settled, patches where the grass hadn't grown back quite right. I counted at least 20 distinct locations. 20 things buried over the 6 months I'd been watching. I stood there in his yard, my heart pounding, and I almost started digging. I had a trowel I'd brought with me, thinking maybe I'd just excavate a little bit, just enough to see what was wrapped in that plastic. But I lost my nerve. What if it really was something horrible? What if I found evidence of a crime and had dug it up illegally, contaminating everything? I climbed back over the fence and spent the rest of the day in a state of anxiety. That night, Richard dug another hole, number 21. I called a police non-emergency line on Monday. I explained what I'd observed, the weekly digging, the plastic-wrapped bundles, the pattern over months. The dispatcher sounded skeptical but said they'd send an officer to talk to me. Detective Ramirez came to my house 2 days later. I showed him my notes, pointed out Richard's house, explained everything I'd seen. He listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Has your neighbor done anything threatening? Any reason to believe he's dangerous? No, but has anyone in the neighborhood been reported missing? Not that I know of, but sir, I appreciate your vigilance, but digging in your own yard isn't a crime. Maybe he's burying pet remains. Maybe it's a personal ritual of some kind. Without evidence of an actual crime, we can't get a warrant to search his property. What if I'm right? What if there's something horrible in that yard? Detective Ramirez sighed. I'll make a note of your concerns. If anything develops, if someone goes missing, if there's any complaint about your neighbor, we'll follow up. But for now, my hands are tied. He left and I felt helpless. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, but without proof, no one would take me seriously. The burials continued through spring, every Saturday night. Richard was nothing if not consistent. By May, I'd documented over 30 burials, 30 plastic-wrapped bundles buried in that yard. Then in June, Richard put his house up for sale. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday, and by Friday there was a sold sticker across it. The housing market was hot, and apparently someone had made an offer immediately. Richard moved out 3 weeks later. I watched the moving truck pull away and felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that he was gone. Frustration that I'd never know what he'd been burying. The new owners moved in a month later. A young couple with a toddler named Emma and Jack. They seemed nice, and the neighborhood welcomed them with the usual casseroles and greetings. I thought about warning them, telling them what I'd seen, but what would I say? The previous owner buried a bunch of stuff in your yard at midnight. They'd think I was crazy, but I couldn't let it go. About a week after they moved in, I went over with a bottle of wine as a welcome gift and tried to subtly bring it up. "So, the previous owner, Richard, did you meet him?" Jack shook his head. "Nope. Whole thing was handled through real estate agents. House was a good deal, though. Needs some cosmetic updates, but the bones are solid. You planning to do any landscaping? The backyard could use some work." Emma laughed. "Tell me about it. We're planning to level it out and put in a patio. Maybe a play area for our daughter. We've got a landscaping crew starting next month." My stomach dropped. "You're going to dig up the backyard?" "Yeah, pretty much. Why?" I hesitated. If I told them what I'd seen, I'd sound insane, but if I didn't and there really was something horrible buried back there, just make sure the crew is careful. Sometimes there's old pipes or whatever buried in older properties. They thanked me for the advice, and I left, my mind racing. The landscaping crew started work on a Thursday morning. I called in sick to work and watched from my window, morbidly curious and terrified about what they might find. They brought in a small excavator to level the yard and remove some old tree stumps. I watched as the machine dug into the soil, scraping away layers of dirt. By lunchtime, they'd found the first bundle. I heard the crew foreman yell, and the excavator shut down. The workers gathered around the hole, and one of them pulled out a black plastic-wrapped object. They carefully cut away some of the plastic, and then I saw one of them pull out his phone. Within 20 minutes, police cars were filling the street. I went outside, my legs shaking, and watched as officers cordoned off the property. Detective Ramirez was there. I recognized him from when he'd visited my house. He saw me and walked over. "You were right to be concerned," he said grimly. "We found something." "What is it?" "We're still excavating, but so far we've found multiple bundles, not bodies though. Animal remains, dogs, cats, maybe some wildlife. All wrapped in plastic, buried methodically." I felt a wave of relief and confusion. "Animals? Looks like your neighbor might have been running some kind of illegal operation. Maybe breeding, maybe animal fighting, maybe just hoarding. The remains show signs of trauma, malnutrition. It's a crime, but not murder. We've got forensics going through everything now." Over the next 3 days, they excavated Richard's entire backyard. They found 34 bundles total, each containing animal remains in various states of decomposition. Dogs, cats, even some exotic animals that shouldn't have been in a residential area. The investigation revealed that Richard had been involved in illegal animal trading, breeding dogs in inhumane conditions, possibly staging fights. When animals died or became unprofitable, he buried them in his yard rather than risk disposing of them properly. He was arrested 2 weeks later in another state, charged with animal cruelty, illegal breeding, and a dozen other crimes. Emma and Jack were horrified. They'd bought a house built on a graveyard of abused animals. They ended up selling the property at a loss and moving out within 3 months. No one wanted to live there after the news coverage. The house sat empty for over a year before finally selling again, this time to an investor who completely demolished it and rebuilt from scratch. I should feel vindicated. I was right that something horrible was happening. The authorities did find evidence of crimes, but here's what haunts me. All those Saturday nights I watched Richard digging, I convinced myself there was nothing I could do. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't have proof, that speaking up would make me look crazy. But those were living creatures suffering in that house, dying, being buried like trash. And I watched it happen for months without doing enough to stop it. I think about the timing. If I'd pushed harder, insisted the police investigate sooner, maybe some of those animals could have been saved. Maybe Richard would have been caught before 34 animals ended up in his backyard. I don't live in that neighborhood anymore. I moved last year, couldn't stand being next to that empty lot where Richard's house used to be. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about him out there in the dark with his shovel. And I think about all the times I saw something wrong and told myself it wasn't my business. I'll never make that mistake again. If I see something that doesn't feel right, I'll speak up, even if people think I'm crazy. Because sometimes your gut is telling you the truth, and silence just lets the horror continue, one burial at a time.